Hello, and welcome into the M&M Discipleship Podcast, where we discuss what it means to be a disciple of Christ. We want to welcome you all back into our podcast. I am Dakota Moody, your host as well. I'm always joined by my co-host, Michael Round. Michael, you doing all right this morning?
I'm doing great, man. Things are good.
That's great. That's great to hear. How did you guys fare in the whole winter storm that we had
So
here? Not
we,
not the last one. I'm talking about the more recent
yeah,
one.
we have nothing. I mean, we have a dusting of
Really?
snow on the ground from Sunday, I guess it was. But yeah, we just have frigid temperatures. Everything went below us, south of us. So even, the coast has got snow and it's ridiculous. I feel so cheated. Uh,
It
we were
it's
we were
wild.
told, yeah, we were told we were going to get snow with that last storm, and that really didn't. I mean, we did get snow, but it didn't amount to near as much as they were expecting it to. And then with this storm, like I said, the coast is even getting lots of snow, and we have nothing except near zero temperatures.
Yeah. I mean, it is literally crazy how that happened because you would always think it's going to be north. This storm, it was just everything was south. I'm seeing pictures from my people in Houston, and they
Yeah.
have multiple inches of snow in Houston, which I can't even fathom. I mean, I don't even remember it ever in the 2 years I lived there, ever it getting cold enough to even consider snowing. And yet
hmm
they have multiple inches on the ground. Everything is shut down out there. It is wild to see that. And then here we got more ice than anything. And yet my parents up in the mountains, North Carolina, in the elevation, nada.
hmm Yep.
Wild.
It
Wild
is.
this fun.
Yeah, and they would be similar latitude to us.
Yeah.
And like you said, usually get more severe weather and nothing.
It is just it's so strange. I can't figure out the weather. I just can't. And I don't feel like these people do either who tell us about the weather, all
Yeah,
right?
as I say, neither do meteorologists.
Neither do they. And they get paid a lot of money to not know. So
Yeah, yeah.
we're some of that for the rest of us. But anyway, with everything we've got going on, we can see all the things that God does in this world. Sometimes we're still left in awe. But with that, we think about who God is, and we think about his impact on this world, and we see the fact that many people sometimes can have some questions, some cynicism towards the belief in God. Kind of like I have towards meteorologists. They can have towards their belief in God in this way, and I think that's kind of interesting. So there's a lot of different arguments that we, I think, as Christians should always be aware of when we're talking about how we can prove the existence of our God. And with this, Michael, I know there's something that you in particular want to discuss today on the topic of apologetics. I'm going to hand the floor over to you.
Definitely. And I wanted to just thank everybody for listening to our episode last week. We had a banner episode, and we appreciate you guys listening. But we also introduced that we're doing something completely different. We're changing things up, and so each episode is going to be slightly different. And for this one, as Dakota mentioned, there's something that's been on my mind. I listened recently to the Joe Rogan podcast with Wes Huff, and it's possible you've seen clips of that or parts of that. And I do want to preface what we're going to talk about by saying, I don't recommend every episode of Joe Rogan. And even if you do listen to his episodes, even the one with Wes Huff, he uses a lot of awful language. And, I don't ever listen to him around your kids. But he sometimes has interesting guests. And he is someone who has been skeptical of Christianity, and he still is, but you can tell he's beginning to be more open and receptive to things about God. And this really is following a stream of people that are sharing more interest in the Christian faith. So I think we have an opportunity as Christians, and that's part of why we talked about conversations with non-believers last week. There's opportunities out there. But he interviews this guy named Wes Huff, who is a guy who works for Apologetics Canada, an organization that shares Christian apologetics. And he's a scholar. He's very well versed in biblical history as well as the biblical text. And he shared a number of things that were interesting. But one of them was around the specific books that are included in the New Testament, specifically the Gospels, and how or why we have the gospels that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, versus some of the other false gospels out there, like the Gospel of Thomas. And they shared in one of their episodes on Apologetics Canada's YouTube channel, Can I Trust the Bible? They shared some of this information and we wanted to share it with you. And so we're going to play this video, and all credit to Apologetics Canada, to Wes Huff. This is their effort. We're just piggybacking on that. And, the video quality and everything like that, that's all them. And I just want to prop it up because I think it's really good information that we can discuss. So I'm going to turn it over to Apologetics Canada and Wes Huff.
A series of scholarly studies has shown that, though Jews were located in many places across the Roman Empire, people's names often tended to be geographically located. By observing literary and archaeological artifacts, a list of common names can be clearly identified. By narrowing down the most popular names in places that Jesus lived, traveled, and ministered, and by comparing these to the list from the studies, an interesting correlation can be seen. Just as we see today with popular names, a qualifier or nickname is often used. For example, notice that when Matthew lists the disciples in his gospel, certain names have a qualifier or nickname and others do not. Simon, called Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. As we would expect, the most popular names are those that have an added description. When we compare the most popular names in Judea and Galilee during the first century with names we see listed in key places in the biblical Gospels, we find that all the names with qualifiers match with what we'd assume if they were actually written in the time and place they claim to be narrating. In contrast, the Gospel of Judas only has two names that would fit, Jesus and Judas, but contains a host of other characters whose names match not with first century Judea or Galilee, like the biblical Gospels, but with names that were popular in Egypt during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Consider how difficult it would be for someone living outside of the locations and times that these events took place to get the right names with the right qualifiers. We have 4 biblical Gospels with 4 different authors, and yet each gets this test of naming frequency and attribution right every time.
It's pretty amazing that you see the qualifiers and you see the information that matches the naming frequency. So what we learned from that is that the 4 gospels that we have, they are written in the time period and in the place in which they claim to be written. So that proves that they are as old as they are. And in their video, they talk about how you could even narrow down names to decades sometimes based on frequency. And this is something that we see, you have with different generations. I know Mackenzie talks about this with her name. There's a lot of Mackenzies that are around her age, and names just become popular and things like that. So I think that's fascinating. And Dakota, when you listen to that, what is it you see?
Well, I think, when we talk about how these things can be important, I think there's something that we don't necessarily talk about that much in the church, and that's that there's a lot of books that claim to have been authoritative scriptural gospels or books of the Bible that didn't get added in. And especially when we talk about like the Joe Rogan podcast and things like that, he's had a lot of people on at different times that have been somewhat cynical towards the idea that the books that we have are actually the ones that should be in the Bible. And I know sometimes it's been claimed, okay, well, the Bible's a creation of the Catholic Church and the 300s and 400s BC and all AD and stuff like that. And why should we trust these the books that we even have in the Bible? And why don't we include some of these other ones? Well, there's reasons for this, and this is just one example of the many reasons why the books that we do have, the 66 books we do have in the Bible, are the ones that we have in our Bible. It's not just some arbitrary list that we've put together. The reason for these is because we've got historical backing from different things, just like this. When we talk about the frequency of name usage, that points to the fact that this is a book that was written in the in Palestine, within Judea, within the Middle East during this time, rather than a document that was clearly written after the fact, in a completely different region like Egypt, trying to take credit for uh, being an authoritative work. And so
Hmm.
there's a lot of different things like this that if you do the research, you look back, you realize, oh man, we've got these 66 books for a reason. It's not
Oh
just
yeah.
because somebody decided to do this because it was convenient. No, there's good evidence, there's good apologetical reasons why the books that we have are the books that we have and that we can trust them.
Yeah, definitely. And it's subtle. Like Matthew didn't set out to prove the validity of his gospel by doing that. It was just plain and simple. There were so many Simons in that day. There were so many so and so's in that day. They had to put a qualifier. Even though a number of Judases or Jesuses, even that was a very common name, Joshua's. But they had to put qualifiers. We're bringing in a family minister here at Westwood, and his name is Jason. And we already have another Jason in leadership. We have Jasons everywhere at church, it seems like. And so we have to qualify which one we're talking about
That's
with a
right.
last name or a nickname. It makes sense. But anyways, like Dakota said, there's a lot of other proofs for why the books that we have are the books we need to have. But that was one I came across. But it begs a bigger question that I think will be a good topic of discussion today, and that is, what is your favorite apologetic? This is one that's piqued my interest. But Dakota, what is your favorite line of reasoning in defending the existence of God?
Yeah, so and before I get into that, I do just want to make sure, because sometimes we can use terms and we take it for granted that everybody just understands the words that we're talking about. When we talk about apologetics, we talk about an apologetic. We're talking about a reasoned argument for in favor of something.
A
Some people,
defense.
yes, a defense, as it comes from the actual Greek word to make a defense, in that way, because sometimes we in our modern day look at the word apologetic and we see a word that we use quite often, apology, and it's
Mhm.
almost like I'm making an apology for my faith in that way, and that makes it sound kind of negative. But actually, what this means is we're making a defense for the gospel, for the proof of our God and the Lord Jesus Christ, in this way. And so when we talk about apologetics, that's what we're referring to. And when we talk about what my favorite argument is, for the belief in God, belief in Christ Jesus our Lord, it comes back to one of the biggest questions that skeptics always ask, which is, if there is an all powerful and all good God, how is it in a world that He created, He allows such terrible things to happen? Because then that would either mean that He is not all good or that He is not all powerful. Either He's got the power to stop it and He doesn't, which means He's not all good, or He wants to stop it but He doesn't have the ability, so that means He's not all powerful. So how can this be reckoned? And this is one of the strongest, I think, arguments that people use against faith, against the belief in our God. Well, I think the bigger question to ask back to that question is, well, what do you know good and bad from? Where does your sense of good or bad come from? And if anybody has read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, you are familiar with this argument because it is kind of the basis for his book, Mere Christianity, when he talks about the fact that if there is a moral law, if there is good and there is bad, then that must mean that that moral law came from somewhere. There must be a moral lawgiver. There must be a standard. Because throughout history, we can see events that happen that are good and bad. Certain generations where one thing is good and another thing is bad, and then the next generation it changes as time goes along. But yet we have an understanding throughout history of many things that we know this is bad. This is morally evil. This is morally suspect. And where do we get that idea from? Well, it has to be from something outside of ourselves because, again, we as a group can convince ourselves of great evil being good. We can see this certainly in the Nazi Germany during the Third Reich, where many
Mhm.
people were convinced that absolute horror and evil were a good and positive thing. And yet, we know morally that what was done there is wrong. Well, how do we know that? Well, if it's just about how many people decide on something, a group of people making this decision, well, naturally we can change that over time because a group of people can be influenced one way or another to decide something. So there must be something outside of ourselves that tells us what is good and what is evil. And there must be a moral law. And if there is a moral law, there has to be a moral lawgiver. There's no other way around it because again, there cannot be a moral law if there's not something outside of ourselves that set forth that moral law. And so if there is good and evil, then there must be a moral law. And if there is moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver. And in
Mm,
this, we know we can feel confident in the fact that that is our God. We know what evil looks like because we know from God what evil is and what good is because he is good and anything that is the absence of him is evil. And while evil exists on this earth, he presented an opportunity to escape the evils of this world by accepting Christ Jesus, his death, burial, and resurrection, putting that on in baptism, so that we can live in a world without evil. Because we corrupted this creation with our sin. But we have a new creation, a new Jerusalem that awaits for us if we put our faith in Jesus Christ to escape the evil. So that is really my favorite apologetic because it is an answer directly to what I think is probably the strongest argument against faith, against Christianity. And we were able to turn that into an argument, I think, for our God and for our
mm.
Creator. So as far as favorite apologetics, that has to be mine.
Oh yeah, yeah. I would agree with you too, how powerful that is. I mean, if we are just the result of evolutionary forces, where does the level of consciousness and morality that we have, where does that come from? Uh, you got a shaky argument outside of the fact that there is a great moral lawgiver
Yes.
for that to develop from. So that's a really good explanation. And before we go any further, I do want to give a resource on that one specifically, and I'll share some more in a little bit. But if you want a basic apologetics book, one by Eric Lyons and Kyle Butt called Reasons to Believe. It's a short book, as you can see. That's one of the reasons they believe is that morality demands a moral lawgiver. So that's a really good one to go for. And you said Mere Christianity. That's also maybe a little bit headier and deeper. So if you're willing to wade in those waters, that would be a good one as well.
Yes, for the
For
advanced
me,
readers out there. Yeah.
yeah, well, and for that too, is while we're going ahead and sharing, if you would like another book that is a little deeper on reasons to believe, something like that, Tim Keller wrote a book, The Reason for God. That book is phenomenal. If you're willing to put in the work, that book is phenomenal. It's not that it's big necessarily, but Keller just thinks on such a high level. I have a hard time keeping up. So, but it's really good. So, The Reason for God, Mere Christianity, and Reasons to Believe, those can all be found online at different book resource places. So, the one that I have, my favorite, is something I was introduced to in a book I read years ago, Darwinism Under the Microscope. And it goes through various apologetics, different lines of reasoning. And the one that I like is from Michael Behe, who wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. And the concept that he taught about is irreducible complexity. The fact that there are things in the universe, most things, are irreducibly complex. And he talks about the cell, the cells that make up our body and the bodies of all kinds of different organisms. They're irreducibly complex. Basically, if you took out one component of the cell, which is one of our most basic forms, it would fall apart. It wouldn't function correctly. It's been described like a mousetrap, that a mousetrap is also irreducibly complex. If you take out what would be, I guess, the spring, then it's not going to slap down. If you take out the bait, you take out the trip plate, then it's not going to slap. I mean, you can't take out one piece and it still work correctly. And the world, ourselves, many things in the world are irreducibly complex, which I think is just phenomenal. And the reason that's important is if you're thinking about linear evolution, you're thinking about periods of time passing and things becoming more and more complex. We might think of it as, there was this primordial soup, then was hit with energy, by some kind of big bang or whatever, and then creatures began to evolve over time, how do you get from this incredibly uncomplex something to something that is as complex as the human body or other ecosystems? You wouldn't be able to build and grow because the missed steps are essential. You can't take any of those steps out.
Mm. And there's been a lot of different ways in which that has been kind of emphasized. I think one of my favorite ones is like the amount of chance, the chance that these things, for one thing to go wrong, that would create such a chain effect that everything that we know would not exist if one simple thing went wrong. Um,
Mhm.
if you see that on display, it would be as though you took all the quarters in the world, and there was one particular year of a quarter that you threw in with all these other quarters, and you filled up the entire Gulf of Mexico with these quarters. The chances
You mean
of
the Gulf
all
of
of
America?
Gulf of anyway,
Sorry.
you just had to, didn't you? Didn't you? Oh, anyway, back on this. So the Gulf of whatever you want to call it, down there, now the Gulf of Mexico, who knows what in the future. Anyway, if you filled it up with quarters, the chances that all the things that we know of would have been able to come into existence and be able to function properly the way that they currently do, from what has been described as even if you had the essential starting blocks built to what it is now, would be like filling up the entire Gulf of Mexico with these quarters, having one year that you're looking for in particular, and you being able to go through all those quarters first time and pick out the right year. That would be the equivalent. That is kind of what we're talking about with what would need to happen. All the things that would need to happen for all that we know to even occur naturally, even if the starting blocks were in place. That again, really, most science does not even have an explanation for where these starting blocks actually came from. They cannot
Oh,
give
yeah.
you a certified answer for where these starting blocks came with. So even if you had the primordial ooze, even if you had the contents for the Big Bang, for all these things to occur to get us to the point where I have now by chance is pretty much impossible. I know another way I've heard it said is, if you threw all the components for a microwave together into a dryer and you just kept setting it to spin around and around again, the chances for everything to be put together the way it would be like if you put all the components for a microwave in a dryer and you spun it randomly and eventually through chance all the components of the microwave came together to make a fully functioning microwave. That's pretty much what would need to happen for everything that we know in existence to occur naturally, even with the starting components, which again, they can't even explain how those starting components came into being without our God being present. So again, I think these are all arguments that lead us towards the idea that there is no way for us to be able to get substance or for us to be able to get the morals that we have, for this to happen without our God.
Mm.
For us to be able to have the substance of our life and for us to be able to have the emotional and moral things within our life, neither of these things can be explained without our God.
Yeah, and I would like to add an extra wrinkle for one last one. Um, F. LaGard Smith wrote a book called Darwin's Secret Sex Problem. Darwin's Secret Sex Problem. And he introduced me to the concept that not only do you have to have the evolution of one of a given species, but you have to have the perfect coexistent evolution of two species of a given type. Not only do you have to have one human to evolutionarily develop, you have to have two, because we made the jump from asexual reproduction, where there was no sex involved, to sexual reproduction. And pretty much every mammal produces sexually. And so for all the different species, they have to, again, evolve at the same time. How statistically impossible. And F. LaGard talks about how sexual reproduction is more complicated among other species than it even is among humans.
Yep.
And when you really go down that rabbit hole, you realize that there's no way that happened by chance,
Mm-mm.
that those kinds of things can come about. The miracle of life, and if you've had children of your own, the whole process, it is just seemingly one miracle after another, that we are able to reproduce in the way that we do. So thinking through all of that we just talked about, you also have to have a second to tango.
Mm. Indeed, and again, I just when you see all these things, it's easy to be, I think, cynical towards the idea of faith when maybe you look at all the evil things in the world, you see moral decay, you see the negative things, or maybe you don't want to have a dependency upon
Mm,
a greater power. You don't want to feel like you have a lack of control and it's all in the hands of a higher power. And I think all of these things uh, can lead people to a lack of faith. But if we are open to the idea of God, if we are open to the idea that there is a God and he exists, I think it's so hard to argue against him truly
mm,
because of all these things that we can see. And I think this is important for us as Christians to be able to understand because I do think that at the end of the day, we can sometimes feel inferior, maybe been made to feel inferior intellectually, maybe made to feel as though we're arguing for ghost and magic, while other people are arguing from science and reason in this way. But really, I do think that we have to understand that I think we do have the right of it. It is easier to have faith in God than it is. It should be easier for us to have faith in God than to not, because it really makes a lot less sense to believe that everything came from. It makes sorry, trying to make sure I'm saying this correctly. It does not make as much sense to believe that everything came from nothing than it does to believe that everything has come from one thing, and that is God, one person. And so I do think we need to understand that, but how do we then use that? How do we frame that? Do we say, "Well, you're stupid for not believing in God"? I
I
know
hope
that
not.
yeah, sometimes we may feel like the people who are against our faith are telling us that we are stupid for believing in God, that we are gullible, that we are superstitious, that we are whatever. But as Jesus demonstrated in his life, just because somebody is giving something like that to us, does that mean we turn around and do the same thing to them?
Mm,
Just because people are potentially putting us down for our faith and saying, well, you are just superstitious, you're ignorant, you're whatever for having a faith in God. When I do think that we do have the reason high ground, how do we use that? Do
mm,
we take that with grace? Do we show people love and mercy? Do we try to show them these things in God, these things about God within reason, or do we say, "Well, I think you're stupid because you don't believe in God. All
mm,
these reasons are slapping you in the face, and you can't see it. You're the ignorant one." We have to be loving and understanding in how we present God to people, not only in the gospel message, but even in His existence.
mm,
Because a lot of times when people do not believe in God, there's usually reasons for it. It's because they've had some sort of loss in their life. It's because they were raised in a certain way in which they don't want to have a faith in God. There's many different things that have factors in this. How we present our faith to other people, how we present God to other people is going to be incredibly important. So we hope that you gained some good insight with this. Maybe some of these things you haven't heard, some things that you haven't considered maybe in a while, and this hopefully strengthened your faith, strengthened your ability to be able to reason for God. But I hope that what you hear at the end of this is that you take these things and you use them with grace, and you use them with wisdom, and you are seasoned with salt in how you speak, and you are able to use these things to glorify God truly and fully.
yeah, yeah. And these are all different tools for our toolbox. And we might never know when information like this could be helpful. That
Absolutely.
video back to the Apologetics Canada, I had never heard that before.
Mm,
And so I wanted to share that with you guys. And we just wanted to share some other apologetics that we like and ones that have helped us. Because
yeah.
at the end of the day, too, Dakota and I, we've wrestled with our faith. And I think any genuine Christian has, from time to time. And so it's important that we know and we have a reason for the defense, for the hope that is within us. So if you have any questions, reach out. But Dakota, is there anything else you'd like to say before we close out?
Not really. We appreciate all y'all joining us, and I'll say this as well. If there's something in particular you want us to talk about on the M&M Discipleship Podcast, we are open to discussing what you guys want to hear about as regards things about faith, and things that matter in this sorts of way. But we're open to these discussions because this is our new format going forward. We're going to try to dig deep on something that hopefully you all are interested in hearing, and that all of it can be done to the glory of God. And this is our hope for the future of the Discipleship Podcast.
So we really appreciate you guys joining us today. Until next time, let's learn from Jesus and strive to live out his teachings. Bye for now.